I just want to pay my respects to the traditional people of this land as well, and from my people, the Wiradjuri on my father's side and the Gamilaroi on my mother's. We bring respect. So first of all, the confession. It's not the coolest thing in the world to admit to, but like millions of us, and I'm sure a lot of you in this room, I watched the royal wedding earlier this year. Our family put aside the usual cynicism to make a night of it. My sister-in-law was in town from Hawaii. She came over to our house with my mother-in-law and her partner. So there we were, an Indigenous Australian with my non-Indigenous wife, her sister, whose late husband was an Indigenous Hawaiian who's now married to a Filipino, their mother, whose partner of 30 years is a New Zealand Maori. I often joke with my wife and her family, are they trying to save the Indigenous populations of the world one at a time by just marrying us all? So we're a modern, multi-ethnic family watching a so-called mixed, half-black, half-white American actress Meghan Markle marry a British blue blood prince. The whole scene revealed in so many ways how flawed the concept of race is. Yet for that moment, the world seemed to be fixated on it. The royal wedding commentary returned to it time and again as the bride was referred to as mixed race or biracial. One British commentator I remember hearing on the night as part of ABC's coverage even wondered ridiculously about the future children of Meghan and Harry, who in her words could be all sorts of colours. Race is a strange subject. It's an utterly discredited notion. Scientists know it is nonsense to even speak of race. We in fact belong to one human family, and advances in the study of DNA show we all draw our heritage from different parts of the globe. In this way, we are all mixed. As geneticist David Reich says in his recent book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, the genome revolution, turbocharged by ancient DNA, has revealed that human populations are related to each other in ways that no one expected. Reich says if we trace back our lineages far enough into the past, we reach a point where everyone descends from the same ancestor. The evidence of human remains, he says, tells us that ancestral Eve was from Africa. Yes, the Queen is an African, and Harry and Meghan, just like the rest of us, are distant cousins. Meghan Markle was in fact no more mixed race than anyone else at her wedding. And as we focus on this question of a world divided, that's what I want to talk about tonight, the question of identity and how it has turned toxic, distorting politics across the globe and threatening the very future of democracy. There's an old philosophical conundrum. It's called the Theseus Paradox. Some of you may have heard of this. The ship of the Greek mythological hero Theseus is kept in dock. Over the years, each of its planks is replaced until it is composed entirely of new planks. So here's the question. Is it the same ship? What if each of the old planks were then reassembled to form a new ship? Is this then the true ship of Theseus? It's a thought experiment that captures the dilemma of identity. Who are we? Are we the same person today as yesterday? Is our identity fixed, or should it reflect the inevitable changes we all experience over a lifetime? As the Greek philosopher Heraclitus put it, we cannot cross the same river twice. Last year in the census, you'd remember that, and kept breaking down and the hours we spent trying to fill it in. I was confronted with my own Theseus Paradox, asked to tick a box declaring whether I was Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Now, no other people in Australia are so explicitly asked to identify themselves. Everyone else is assumed to be Australian, whatever their particular ancestry. Now, on one level, this is simply a numbers exercise. It determines how many people are Indigenous, and it may be of some use administratively to assist in government policy. Yet on another level, there is something insidious happening here. Administrators in Australia have a troubling history of identifying Aboriginal people. The Australian Law Reform Commission counts more than 60 different definitions of what it is to be Indigenous. At various times, depending on how one was defined or whether you'd spent too much time in the sun, it could determine whether one could get a drink in a pub, swim in a public pool, attend school, or in some cases, be separated from family. The academic and Indigenous woman Marcia Langton once wrote, "For Aboriginal people, resolving who is Aboriginal and who is not is an uneasy issue, located somewhere between the individual and the state." With such a vexed history, with identity so in flux, how could that box possibly contain all of me? Let me tell you about my grandmother. Now, she lived a life on the margins, locked out in segregated 1930s Australia. She was turned away from hospital when she was giving birth to her first child. She watched as police bulldozed her tin humpy to the ground, leaving her and her children destitute. She was harassed and ostracised. She experienced the full weight of the racism of old colonial Australia. My grandmother was white. She lived with an Aboriginal man, had black children. Her stepfather and half-brother were black, but she was white. How could I tick a box in the census defining me that my white grandmother, who had suffered so greatly, living effectively as an Aboriginal person, could not? My son can tick that box, but not his mother. I consider myself an Indigenous person, proudly. It is important to me. I have Indigenous heritage on both my mother's and my father's side, but it's not all I am. I have Irish heritage, some German, some Chinese, we suspect. Like Theseus' ship, I am composed of many new planks. The Indian philosopher and economist Amartya Sen has written extensively about issues of identity and justice. He warns of what he calls solitarist identities, the dangers of limited or restrictive ideas of identity. A solitarist approach, he once wrote, is a good way of misunderstanding nearly everyone in the world. He wrote, "Our shared humanity gets savagely challenged. Singular classifications," he said, "can make the world inflammable." In his words, identity can kill and kill with abandon. As a reporter, this is the world I've seen up close. Our world is riven with conflicts founded on hyper ideas of identity. Think of Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, Israeli versus Palestinian, Serb and Croat, Hindu against Muslim, the blood feud of Sunni and Shia Islam, Catholic versus Protestant in Northern Ireland. A sense of identity, Sen wrote, can firmly exclude people even as it warmly embraces others. While Sen highlights extreme cases of identity-inspired violence, he does point out that there is much that is admirable in identity. It can be a source of great nourishment and belonging. Certainly in my case, the sense of kinship found in my community has been a great pillar of my life, a great source of strength and inspiration. But what I've taken from Sen and my experiences reporting this world is the idea that I can look outside of myself, to look beyond the idea of reductionism, to avoid the impulse of dangerous singular affiliation. In Australia, the Indigenous scholar Yin Paradis has sought to escape what he calls a prison house identity. Paradis chafes at orthodox interpretations of what it means to be Aboriginal. He says he blends Indigenous, Anglo-Asian heritage. He says he represents both coloniser and colonised. He is at once black and, as he says, consummately white. Paradis touches a raw nerve, striking at the fragility of collective identity. He reminds us of what the Theseus Paradox exposes, How can there be any permanent sense of being when we are all the sum of many parts? Contemporary Indigenous identity is underpinned by the evolution of a pan-Aboriginality, a shared blackness often informed by history, a history of dispossession, exclusion, discrimination and brutality. My grandmother experienced all of that. She lived in and was loved by an Indigenous community, but could not say that she was in fact Indigenous. Paradox doesn't deny what he calls a deplorable history of marginalisation, discrimination and exclusion, but he does say it does not solely define him. Kwame Anthony Appiah is a Ghanaian British philosopher who spent a lifetime exploring these vexed questions of identity. He once wrote, "The shaping of my life is up to me." Appiah says identities make ethical claims. We live our lives, he says, as gay or straight or male or female, black or white, and sometimes those categories themselves are blurred, less certain. Appiah asks, do identities curb our autonomy or provide its contours? Are we prisoners of identity? At its worst, when I think of rigid collective identities, I'm reminded of the line from the author Franz Kafka, "A cage went in search of a bird." I remember the moment that I knew Donald Trump would win the election, that he had Hillary Clinton's measure. I was watching the first debate, which the pundits overwhelmingly awarded to Hillary Clinton. And I texted my wife and I said, he can win this. Why? Because he was telling a story that resonated with deeply held sense of identity. He was talking to the left behind, those who believed they'd lost their country, who'd seen their jobs disappear, their factories shut down as America signed up to new free trade deals. They longed for certainty and they rejected the tenets of liberalism, open trade, open borders. They believed that Washington had abandoned them. They looked at Hillary Clinton and saw a Washington insider who would call them the deplorables. When Trump said he would drain the swamp, when he pledged to make America great again, they heard him. This was identity politics in action. Both sides played it, Clinton and Trump. Trump won. Worryingly, this is Amartya Sen's solitarist identities, and it is tearing at our world. It is at the heart of what we now call identity politics. Across 3 decades in journalism, I've seen old divisions of race, religion, tribalism, and nationalism reassert themselves. This was the steady unravelling of what we call the liberal global order, the repudiation of what political scientist Francis Fukuyama at the end of the Cold War called the end of history, as he saw it, the ultimate triumph of liberal democracy over communism. But history has returned. Borders are going back up. Democracy itself is in retreat. The strong man is back. Just think of them. Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, Duterte in the Philippines, Sisi in Egypt, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and of course, in his own way, Donald Trump, each riding a wave of resurgent populism, each promising to make their countries great again. Identity is back, an instinctive, hard-wired tribalism that leads us to cling to our own and reject those deemed outsiders. It's a 21st century law of the jungle, something deeply primal. It seems that we are not entirely different to chimpanzees and just as likely to tear each other from limb. This is the world sketched by the American lawyer and academic Amy Chua in her new book, Political Tribes. Professor Chua traces how identity politics is remaking our world and has already triggered a revolution in American politics. She says tribal instinct is not just an instinct to belong, it is an instinct to exclude. The US, she says, is in a perilous new situation, with nearly no one standing up for an America without identity politics, for an American identity that transcends and unites the identities of all the country's subgroups. This is what the Indian writer Pankaj Mishra calls the age of anger. We prize identity more than citizenship. American political scientist Mark Liller has condemned the growth of this identity politics as a cancer on democracy. In his recent book, The Once and Future Liberal, Liller despairs at how we are abandoning the idea of shared citizenship. He says it is a disastrous foundation for democratic politics. America, he says, is in a moral panic about racial, gender and sexual identity that has distorted liberalism's message. The question of identity politics right across the political spectrum is one of the key issues of our time. And history is often the pulse of this populist identity politics. But it is a history of betrayal. It is a narrative of loss, of being robbed of inheritance. This history looms over the present, obscuring progress. There is just the past framing the present and denying the future. Mark Liller calls this the apocalyptic imagination. In his 2017 book, In Praise of Forgetting, journalist and philosopher David Reef challenged the adage that those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Reef warns thinking about history is sometimes far more likely to paralyse than encourage. He says we risk turning it into a formula for unending grievance and vendetta. Now, there is an antidote to the perils of identity. It is cosmopolitanism. I am undoubtedly a cosmopolitan. I've enjoyed an international career. I've lived outside of Australia for the best part of 2 decades. I've called London, Hong Kong, Beijing, Abu Dhabi, Dubai home. I've reported from more than 60 countries, and I've spent enough long stretches in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq and Israel to feel equally at home there. I can tell you where to buy the best dumplings in Shanghai or the best takeaway chicken meal in Amman. I could help you buy a guitar in Kabul or watch a film at my favourite art house cinema in Tel Aviv. I count among my dearest friends, colleagues from Iran, Pakistan, Iraq, China, Canada, South Korea. All of this has shaped me. It's given me a glimpse into worlds I only could imagine as a boy. Cosmopolitans are citizens of the world. My family is the essence of a cosmopolitan family. Cosmopolitanism answers the Theseus Paradox. It isn't the ship that is the identity, it is the very planks themselves. Cosmopolitanism, though, poses critical questions. Personal, social identity is one thing. We are free to identify however we wish. But what happens when that becomes political? Is there a place for group rights? And if so, under what circumstances? Who decides? The historian David Hollinger says historical events have destabilised identities, weakening political solidarity. Groups are not permanent or enduring, he says. There is too much emphasis on homogeneity. They may make a case for group rights, but don't ask who actually belongs to the group. Hollinger, in his book Post-Ethnic America, even argues against multiculturalism, not because he doesn't respect ethnicity and culture, but because he says it organises around ideas of fixity and givenness. He says it encourages identity formed around affiliations from a history of political and economic victimisation based on bad biology. As someone who identifies as Indigenous, in a country where Indigenous identity can be fraught and politically charged, cosmopolitanism presents as a liberating idea that allows for a deeper and more complex sense of myself and justice beyond the fixed notions of race that can include me and my white grandmother. Yet in a world of tribes, that dream may be farther away than ever. Even those who seek to free themselves from tribalism risk being trapped in their own contradiction. As Amy Chua reminds us, cosmopolitanisms don't see how tribal their cosmopolitanism actually is. Once we play the politics of identity, we risk being trapped in its logic. We are locked in a zero-sum game of us versus them. The politics of identity weakens democracy from within at a very time it's being challenged from without by resurgent authoritarianism. The failure to find a sense of shared citizenship beyond our differences, the retreat into tribalism, is fracturing our polity and fueling fear, mistrust, intolerance, derision and xenophobia. And that is mother's milk to populists and demagogues of all political persuasions. Yet for all of that, identity undoubtedly matters. It matters to me. Cosmopolitans failed to see this. The end of history liberals after the Cold War, who imagined a globalised utopia of free movement of people and goods, failed to see this. We are witnessing the blowback, driven by the worst instincts of identity. Like my family watching the royal wedding, I believe we are better together. But the challenge for liberals who believe in a cosmopolitan future is to respect the best of identity while being able to appeal to a sense of belonging and justice that transcends it. It isn't mocking people or dismissing them as deplorable. I'm heartened by something that the philosopher Isaiah Berlin once said. More people in more countries at more times accept more common values than is often believed. Thank you.